We'll start the night tonight in Egypt, where Egyptians will vote on a new constitution on January 14th and 15th of this year. The constitution will be the cornerstone of the transition the country is undergoing after ousting of the former president Mohamed Morsi. The constitution, like any, shapes how the country will be governed and will highlight the rights and obligations of the people and the leadership. But what about the economy? Yasser Hakim takes a look at the economic section of the constitution.
There are 247 articles in the new constitution. 24 of those are pertaining to the economy. It says Egypt is a free market economy, but with regulations that guarantee better living conditions for its citizens. Several articles were deemed essential by experts. Articles 14, 17 and 21 stress on the importance of the private sector in leading the road to development, and industry should be a main pillar of the national economy.
It is safe to say that the constitution gives enough protection to the private sector to own and invest without fear of bureaucracy or nationalization of assets like before. The message is that there will be unprecedented support for the private sector in the future.
This includes the informal economy, which thrived in the past 10 years. It employs nearly 4 million workers and constitutes about 40% of the economy. It deprives the government of billions of dollars every year.
Parallel economy, if legal, should pay around $22 billion in tax annually. Official tax revenue this year was about $44 billion. That's one item. The constitution obliges the government to end the shadow economy, and as important, it encourages SMEs to flourish.
Experts say small and medium enterprises should be the backbone for development in Egypt, just as it was in emerging economies in Asia and Latin America. On a socio-economic dimension, the document requires the government to ensure 10% of its GDP is spent on health, education and scientific research, currently at a meager 0.002%. It also required to nearly double the minimum wage for workers and employees. A commendable move, but a huge burden on a government with a 14% budget deficit and a $300 billion public debt.
To finance these new obligations that will cost about $10 billion, we're planning to remove subsidies on energy and reduce government expenditure. But what is more important is to increase our revenues from taxes and services to cover these costs.
On paper, experts say this constitution lays strong foundations for the economy. But again, this can only succeed if the country retains the security and stability that Egyptians are longing for. Yasser Hakim for CCTV, Cairo.
All right, for more on this, we're joined now live by Yasser Hakim, who's with us from Cairo, Egypt. Thank you for joining us tonight, Yasser. How is the business community receiving this constitution?
Well, with cautious optimism, if you might say. There are clauses in this constitution such as prohibiting nationalization, something that happened twice, once in the 1960s and recently 2 or 3 years ago when privatized companies were given back to the government from their private owners. And the 2012 constitution did not prohibit that. This year's constitution prohibits a nationalization of industries. Another thing is that it's requiring the government to get rid of all the bureaucracy. That's another setback for investors in Egypt. A big problem for Egyptian rules and regulations is that bureaucracy is quite deep in the country, as well as the constitution is helping to give more facilities, is calling to give more facilities to foreign investments to Egypt. So overall it looks nice on paper, and the implementation is more important for the businessmen in the next few months.
Yasser, the constitution would be ratified next week. Is the government ready to fund the measures it's proposing? For example, to ensure that 10% of its GDP be spent on health, education and science, and to almost double the minimum wage for workers?
Yeah, just the minimum wage alone will cost around $8 billion with a government that's having a huge budget deficit and over $300 billion in debt. It's a big problem. But The government says this will only start work in the new fiscal year that's starting next June. It says it will be gradual. It will not be implemented the whole 10%. They're asking that to be gradual over 5 to 6 years. There are some plans, short-term plans obviously is aid from the Gulf Arab states and tax revenues. On the medium-term plans, they're hoping tourism revenues would increase after the elections and the roadmap is over. There will be more investments, more tourists coming into the country, so more revenue. And on the long term, there are a number of projects, mega projects, that the government hopes will bring in more income on a longer term basis. So for now, they're trying to get it over 4 or 5 years, not immediately in this year's fiscal budget.
All right, thank you for that. That's Yasser Hakim in Cairo for us. We go now to Libya, where trouble around oil fields in Libya is far from over, as a glimmer of hope was reignited just a few days after production was resumed at the El Sharara field in the south of the country. Rebels in the eastern end of Libya are locked in a battle with the government, and they have offered to protect tankers in the region after the government's navy blocked one vessel from taking on its cargo. The rebels declared the region semi-autonomous last year, and they now plan to use some of the country's export facilities to export oil. They maintain that oil companies are eager to buy oil regardless of the origin. The region's Libyan Oil Gas Corporation has written to international oil companies offering to ensure the safety of tankers loading at Es Sider, which is one of the country's biggest ports. And staying with Libya, the country's energy minister says the government will sue and cut off any firms buying oil from ports under rebel control. The prime minister warns that the tankers may be sunk.
Any firm dealing with the armed groups which have closed the oil ports will be sued and banned from any future cooperation with Libya. There won't be any market for them in Libya anymore. We are warning all global and small firms against dealing with the armed groups.
We will not hesitate to protect the Libyan ports or protect against assaults against the sovereignty, even if it means sinking any ship or carrier approaching the Libyan ports.
We go now to Zambia, where plans to establish a sovereign wealth fund to spur investment outside of its mining industry. President Michael Sata said the fund will focus on stimulating investment in strategic non-mining industries, on expanding the country's investment portfolio, and on creating jobs. Africa's biggest copper producer joins the continent's largest oil producers, Nigeria and Angola, in establishing sovereign wealth funds. According to the agricultural minister, the fund will be refinanced through dividends of about 40 state-owned companies, while the government will put in some seed capital. Kenya begins its process of raising between $1.5 and $2 billion from the international market through Eurobonds by the end of January. Kenya's Treasury Secretary says the money will be used partly to plug a $265 million budget deficit and to retire a $600 million syndicated loan borrowed from global banks in 2012. The loan is also expected to shore up the Central Bank of Kenya's foreign exchange reserves, which currently stands at about $6 billion. Mr. Rotish told a media briefing that preparation of the bond issuance is ongoing, but he would not divulge further details due to regulatory. The Nigerian government has announced plans to establish a new mortgage refinancing company in an effort to revive its housing and construction sector. According to a report by the Minister of Finance on federal government projects, the company is scheduled to be inaugurated on January 16th. The new mortgage company will, in essence, enhance the provision of more houses at affordable prices. An estimated 14 pilot states have already been earmarked for the program, and governors of those states have already agreed to provide and fast-track land titles, foreclosure arrangements, and service plots. At the end of the project, more than 200,000 mortgages are expected in the next 5 years, all at affordable interest rates. All right, we're taking a short break, but here's what's coming up next. UK members of Parliament censured the Department of International Development over their move to slash aid in South Africa.
BizAsia. Asia means business.
All right, welcome back. We'll start back in the UK, where British members of Parliament have criticised the UK's decision to end bilateral aid to India and South Africa by 2015. MPs termed the move as neither methodical nor transparent, but instead relating to short-term political pressures. Justine Greening, the International Development Secretary, announced in November of 2012 that Britain would end direct aid to India in 2015. Just 6 months later, she said Britain's development program in South Africa would also come to an end in 2015, a decision the South African government has harshly criticized. The move to phase out aid to these countries that are now being defined by the World Bank as middle-income economies followed a review by the Department of International Development. The organization's review of multilateral and bilateral aid programs in 2010 resulted in Britain's cutting back its bilateral aid programs from 43 to 27 of the countries which it assessed. All right, for more analysis on this, we're joined live by Melanie Ralph, who's with us in London. Thank you for joining us tonight, Melanie. Melanie, some MPs are accusing the Department for International Development of cutting aid to India and South Africa in response to media pressure or in response to not following the standard protocol for how this would go about. Was this move by Britain one purely of political self-interest?
Well, no doubt, as austerity grips the global economy, aid has become a contentious issue and, in some circumstances, a political pawn. Compared to others, South Africa hasn't been the biggest beneficiary of Britain's aid pot. The aid programme to India, for example, which is also getting the axe, is in the region of £280 million, much larger than the 19 million that goes to South Africa. The official response from the government's Department for International Development says the decision to cut South Africa's aid follows on from the government's own 2011 aid review, which identified South Africa as being on the path to transition. Whether it was a shrewd political move by the UK government to appease an austerity-stricken public is anyone's guess. What we do know is that the British government could have handled it better by giving South Africa the heads up they were going to go and do it.
Melanie, UK ministers insist that the relationship with South Africa should now be based on trade and not aid. How will this move go to affect the relationship dynamics between the two countries?
Well, as I said, the way this decision was announced angered South Africa at the time of the announcement last year. South African officials were angered by the move and that this withdrawal of aid would affect the bilateral relations going forward. All that being said, Britain remains one of South Africa's biggest investors, making up nearly half of the country's R1 trillion of foreign direct investment stock, according to the central bank figures. So when it comes down to the nitty-gritty of business, both sides have got too much to lose by holding a grudge. That being said, it may take some time for South Africa's trust in the UK to be built up again.
All right, thank you for that. That's Melanie Ralph joining us live in London. And we go now to personal drones, which the Las Vegas Consumer Electronics Show, where personal drones have caused quite a bit of buzz. Some of the flying objects being shown include items that are for play, personal photography, and other items whose uses have yet to be determined. The notion of personal drones follows widespread use by the U.S. military and a growing reliance by law enforcement on such aerial technology. Retail giant Amazon has in the meantime hatched a plan to create delivery drones, and French-based technology firm Parrot unveils its mini drone toy, which can be controlled from a smartphone. All right, we go now to the markets to see what we've been tracking here for you at BizAfrica. Closing the day today, the Nigerian all-share index is in the red, down 1.12%. The JSE is closing the day also in the red, down 0.41%. The Nairobi Securities Exchange is closing the day in the green, up 0.67%. And the EGX is closing the day today in the green as well. It's up 1.27%. And that's all we have for you for business tonight.